With that, welcome to our next episode of Our Continent. And today I'm super happy to have Timi with me. You have a very interesting life so far, from Google over different entrepreneurships to the idea now connecting Europe by Latin language. And I'm so happy to have you here. And can you first of all explain how did your life evolve to that point of time that we meet here at this situation?
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas, for the intro. I see you avoided pronouncing my last name, which is a very wise choice because usually it doesn't go well on this type of podcast. Who am I? How do I start this? I'm just, I would say, how to identify myself as a European, as a pan-European activist of sorts, as a Slovenian, of course, as well, because it's also part of my identity. My life story, in a sense. If I speak more from the career side and start from there, I studied political science in school, so I was always enthusiastic about social sciences and humanities. And during the course of those studies, even in high school, for example, I started getting more and more enthusiastic about the pan-European cause. I thought it was the only worthy cause in the European context that we should aim for in this geopolitical climate. And I started thinking through those terms through college and through my political science studies. I wrote several articles during my studies on that topic as well. And then, funny enough, political science wasn't necessarily the type of studies that would lead me to a very lucrative and luxurious life, even though it's not my aim to be luxurious. But in any case, it wasn't a very prosperous thing from the get-go. I tried journalism, I tried, like I said, articles and stuff. So I started pivoting a bit more towards business, and I did a bunch of things, but my most, let's say, resounding, or the thing I'm most proud of, is right before I ended college, I became the coordinator of an NGO in Slovenia that we managed to scale to be the biggest NGO in tax income donation in Slovenia, by far. It was a massive success story. And I recruited personally from basically zero. I recruited 30 representatives, mostly students, and now there are more than 120 of them right now active all across Slovenia. After that, I went and joined Google in Dublin. So Dublin is the EMEA headquarters for Google. I was there almost for 2 years. I wasn't. I don't want to offend your Irish audience, but I wasn't the biggest fan of Ireland per se. And also I wasn't the biggest fan of a corporate environment. I was always the kind of grassroots startup slash NGO type of person. So my plan was always to exit Google just to get some experience and then exit. And then after almost 2 years, I went to Lisbon, where I was the co-founder of a tech travel startup. After that didn't work out as planned, I embarked on a 1 year, not 1 year, that would be too good, on a 4 month, on a 4 month, I don't know why I say 1 year, it sounded better for marketing, on a 4 month backpacking tour around the world. The thing is, initially it was meant to be 1 year, but I've kind of figured out that 1 year, because I was traveling very kind of harsh countries, or let's say harsh parts of the countries in many ways. I was backpacking through Africa and Asia, so Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, India, China, Japan, Iran, Iraq, and the goal of this trip was, because I left my startup, let's say, and I had this free time. And the goal of this backpacking trip was to really get to know the other civilizations, let's say, there are, and I was reading, for example, Bhagavad Gita in India, and I was reading in every those cultures I tried to read very significant philosophical texts that they basically created. But what I found on this trip while doing this is that no matter how much I try, I cannot understand fully, or even to a satisfactory degree, for example, India or China, or even India is so complex and diverse. It's very hard to even say I can understand India because it's so so big and diverse. What I found out actually was that through my studies of these civilizations and cultures, I was understanding my own better, because I was thinking still through the prism of a European, and the idea of Via Nova was born a bit out of that, right? I always had, and the co-founders of Via Nova, we always had this pan-European aspect of us, and we always thought through those prisms. But for example, when I was on this trip in India and I was observing those people and how proud they are of their identity, it kind of felt to me like Europe is missing something. Especially because right now the conversation about European integration and unification is mostly centered around economical things and political things, like institutions and markets. So we're missing something deeper, like what is European identity? You know, that isn't spoken enough of, and Villanova was born out of that. And another consideration that I've always had, you know, since I became this pan-European, consciousness, whatever European consciousness person, I was thinking, what should be the language of Europe? Because to me it was evident that we need a medium for communication for various purposes, including markets, but also for identity, right? And initially I was a fan of. I was a fan. I was like, it seemed like a lesser of I don't know, multiple evils to choose English because like it's most convenient and it's kind of transformed into an international lingua franca and also as a consequence as a European lingua franca. But after being on this trip and after thinking about linguistic integration of China and India, which for all intents and purposes are even more diverse probably than Europe. You know, in Europe we like to emphasize our own diversity as if we are the only kind of part of the world that experiences this sort of heterogeneity. But India and China are super diverse and also linguistically, but they were able to unite under one initially minority language that meant something to them into a civilizational sphere to an extent, let's say. Of course, it's never perfect, but to an extent. And I was inspired then, looking at this, to think of an alternative, which on face value sounds ridiculous, of course, and your viewers will think it's ridiculous when I utter it out loud. But the more I thought about it, the more it makes sense. And so the answer to what can facilitate European collective soul-seeking or identity-seeking, whatever, and what is the answer to Europe linguistic integration, in my opinion, is a language, the only language that's ever connected in our collective subconsciousness with a pan-European language. That is Latin, you know. And so I can end my monologue here, and you can continue with.
That's a impressive way of coming from politics, going over business, back to the mixture between politics or business, or better to say, you studied politics, you did business, and you saw it's not only about politics and business, and you decided to do something else. you decided to open the third box. That's super interesting, and I wanna start with one thing that you talked about. You talked about the European civilization, and in the former episodes of this podcast, we also tried to get closer to the idea what is the European civilization. So for yourself, what do you define as the European civilization or the European group?
Yeah, so I think in many ways Europe is being characterized as a tale of two cities, right? It's Athens and Jerusalem, essentially, right? We're trying to either reflect upon or imitate the metaphor of those two cities, right? Athens, of course, with the Greek philosophy, and then Jerusalem with the let's say to an extent the Hebrew heritage and what came after it, Christianity and such. But so this is the object of our inquiry. But who is the subject? Who is doing the inquiry? Who is doing the reflection? Who is doing the imitation? And metaphorically, that's represented by the city of Rome, right? We are Rome. Rome was the one who was, looking at those cities to Athens and to Jerusalem, to the cultures outside of it, right? So Europe, in a sense, is a continuity of Rome, right? And every period of European history, in a sense, was trying to reference itself towards Rome. Every Renaissance, Carolingian Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance of the 15th, 16th century, 14th century, etc., and even up until now, right? We are trying to reference Rome in our institutions, etc. So metaphorically, Europe is Rome trying to look at Athens and Jerusalem, right? There's the interplay. So we are a synthesis of all those things. Now, it's not just that. Europe as a cultural concept originally entered our consciousness probably with the Carolingians, right? So the first mention of Europe as a separate cultural sphere happened in the 8th century. We were trying to record the Battle of Tours, right? When the Europeans, as they were called, and it was called in Latin, the it was written in Latin that we kind of defeated in this first mention of Europeans, that we defeated the Saracens. This is the first mention of Europeans as a separate cultural sphere, and since then Europe as a civilizational concept has been kind of identified with the Latin West and Latin Europe, right? And of course now it's starting to incorporate more, and we have a lot of other entities have entered the frame into the European Union, let's say, right? But Europe is a continuity from Rome. That's how I would classify it. But it's very important now to, once we establish this, to establish another thing. Europe is not one thing. That's also a characteristic of every civilizational state. There are some threads, of course, like this, but every civilization, that's how the paradigm that I use and that we kind of try to promote in Via Nova as well, it's a constellation, right? It's a constellation of different, sometimes contradictory ideas. So when for example, the Carolingian times, a lot of the synthesis happened between the Germanic cultures, Christianity, and the original Greco-Roman thought, right? And all those things, to an extent, were contradictory. So, for example, the Germanic warrior culture was in contradiction with the Christian pacifist ethics. But together they formed the idea of chivalry, for example, right? So a constellation was formed. Now, if we fast forward to now, for example, we have a lot of ideologies in Europe, namely, at least in politics, we have socialism, we have conservatism, we have liberalism, right? Is the main three, I guess, to an extent. We have also others, but those three are more interlinked than we think. Because we are in Europe, we are used to thinking in universalist terms. We think that it's either that or no, but like all those things together are what make our psyche. And you and I, in different ways, are a constellation of all those thoughts, contradictory thoughts, and we have a different constellation. And on the aggregate side, as an aggregator, Europe is a constellation in this moment, of all these influences. But there is a thread, of course. But we are characterized by deep diversity and a long historical memory, and that's also the definition of a civilizational state, in my opinion.
That's a very high-level approach on talking about the civilization and talking about where we come from, and I totally get that. And but if we really go to the streets and talk with people, there is a big discussion right now: who is European, who is German, who is French, who is. Do you think in that categories, like the countries that we are having right now? Because as I understand you have a way wider approach, driven by culture, driven by history, and not really driven by the borders that we have right now. How would you see the current situation that we are very concentrating on the certain countries on low level, and on the midi level concentrating on the borders of European Union, instead of concentrating on Europe as a continent and as one civilization?
I think it is all about how we manifest our subconsciousness, because my suggestion is, and our suggestion is, that we all carry these similarities. We are, even if we are not aware of it on a conscious level, we are still Europeans. You cannot escape this reality. But then how this manifests is different. So if we choose to emphasize the differences, which do exist, of course, because we are a complex, very diverse continent, then we will remain diverse. If we emphasize that I'm Slovenian, you're Swiss, whatever, then we will remain in those categories. But if we, based on those similarities and this thread that I think I outlined, and of course it can be articulated better and in more detail by people who have thought more about this than me, but if we start emphasizing those threads, those things together, and we start building common myths, common rituals, common traditions, common markers, such as a language, which is, in our opinion, the most important marker, right? Then we start thinking of ourselves as Europeans. So this is a long process, and the generation before us, our parents and grandparents and stuff, they were much more entrenched into national identities than we are, right? We are the Erasmus generation. We are the ones who've been to Europe and been outside of Europe and seen a little bit okay, there is something about being European. Another note, for example, when I was traveling in India and China, I even more intensely felt that I am European, because you start to see the differences. So I think our generation is more aware of that, and it will continue to be more aware of that. Now it's on us now, and initiatives like Via Nova and yours, to really explore and create this sense of Europeanness. And that's why Via Nova is named Via Nova, so the new path, right, the new way, because we are trying to create this new identity. Now, it's a dialogue, right? It's not about me saying it's this or that. It's about us creating this common story together. Okay, now the zeitgeist is we need to create this European state. We need to unite. This is the only way for us to preserve our values and to project them onto the world and peace and everything, all those things, right? So now we have to construct for greater legitimacy of this project. We need to construct all those things that you said that on the low level, for lack of a better term, everybody will feel in their consciousness. I am European. This is what is being European is all about.
That's a good point, because I wanted to ask that, because right now I would assume, without asking all Europeans, that if you ask somebody from Europe, like, what is your identity? Where does it come from? Why are you European? And why do you feel like a European? I would suggest that the least part would take it back to Jerusalem and to Athens and to the philosophic trade. So what you're saying is we have to find out and find a new way of building that common sense, that common feeling of a civilization together. You're working on that. Others are also working on that. Is it a possibility for you that at some point of your project you come to the point saying, okay, that was our idea, but we cannot push it to, or we cannot implement it into the broader community because there is not that need or that consideration of exactly that thought, because I think it's still a little bit abstract and it needs kind of a lot more of understanding than just saying this is Europe and this is our borders.
100%. That's why Via Nova is not, a short-term fix or a short-term project. It's meant to be like a long kind of dialogue between generations, right? Every culture is a dialogue between generations, and ours is no different. And Via Nova was built for this to be a long time thing. We are not rushing into it because those things should not be rushed into. So yeah, you are correct. We are not. If we will hit a wall at a certain point. We are still probably. I'm now like doing conjectures, but we are probably not ready for a type of overwhelming, overarching identity that would, it takes time for those things to build, right? It always took time. I would argue though that in this era we have tools to kind of accelerate those things. We have digital tools. The world is more united. We can, I think, over a generation and with the school system, we can, if there is political will, we can move towards that identity a lot faster, and the same is true for Latin, which I assume we will touch on later. But of course, it's not a foregone conclusion that this pan-European thing is going to happen in the next weeks, in the next years. We are here because we believe in it, not because we think it's might happen tomorrow, right? We are sticking with it because we think it's the best thing for Europeans to do. And that's basically the ethos of Via Nova. So we will strive and we will do our best, and we will try to, from this, like you said, abstract, high-level thinking, we will try to find ways to put it in other forms, and we'll see what happens. But this is our mission, and we are sticking with it, yeah.
And the whole concept of thinking, I think it's very right, because you're following the historical path and the cultural path mixed with philosophy. For my feeling in Germany, I went to school in Germany. We talk very less about Europe, and we talk about like the evolution of philosophy and of society and civilization of ancient Greek, of Jerusalem and all that. But I don't think that we ever, also in terms of what we are teaching, making the connection to Europe and to the European civilization, leading me to the second point that we don't have that thought initially in our heads, because in the school we're talking a lot about, okay, this is a nation. We talk about the French nation a lot because of Napoleon, because of the revolution and everything. We talk about, obviously, World War I, World War II a lot. But we don't do this path. So we are generating children and later adults that never thought about that way of thinking. What is your approach to approach those people that in 90% of the cases never thought about that idea that Europe now could have a connection to Jerusalem and to the whole philosophic idea of ancient Greek? How do you get it to them? Because even in times today, which you also said like could be beneficial, like with social media, with fast evolving news, you can reach out to people very easy. But the, let's call it mainstream idea of this is a border, this is a country, this is European Union can also very good enforce and influence the people. So like, how do you try to get it to those that don't have the pre-knowledge about the whole connection?
Yeah, I think this is a question primarily when it comes to educational system of political interest, because right now, of course, it's changing, but the political interest was mostly geared towards the nation state, right? This is how we operated, right? This was the political reality. Right now, of course, it's a bit shifting because we are realizing that only a strong united Europe can really carry itself through in this multipolar world. So I'm assuming and I'm hoping that in the future there will be more of those things in our classrooms when it comes to European identity and all those things, right? Up until now, there was no perceived necessity of this because we felt secure and sound in our NATO system where we're all nation states, and this was the narrative that was in the educational system. Nonetheless, I still feel like that our nation states, let's say, I'm not sure about Germany, but like in Slovenia, for example, there were some attempts, although much subtler than the Slovenian identity narrative attempt, to kind of push this Europeanness a little bit, right? And European Union has had their own initiatives, they were trying to do some, even Erasmus as a project, was meant for this. So there was some push into this European identity, in my opinion. It wasn't as strong as the nation state kind of narrative, but there was, right? So there is a foundation to work with. And I think going above the whole educational system thing, I think we are seeing right now a surge of a lot of young people who do identify with Europe, not because of their educational system told them to, but because they just feel like that's the right thing to do in this moment. And as I said, the circumstance of us, the ease of travel right now, it's much easier to travel, right? So we see the similarities. I think it is growing, the whole movement, the whole identity regarding Europeanness. But like you mentioned, of course, there are people who are not convinced, the ones who think that the nation state is their primary identity. And by the way, Villanova is not saying to people that Europeanness or Germanness or Slovenianness or whatever is. There's no hierarchy necessarily, right? But we are trying to just establish a European identity. So there could be, like, for example, you could be Swiss first and then European later. So the most important thing is for us to establish a European identity. But regardless, I think the only way is for actors like you and me to really promote this debate, to put ourselves in front. And ultimately, when the geopolitical situation necessitates even more of those type of actions, we try to push, also our political class to go into that direction. Because without that, as you correctly observed, there can be no, for example, shifts in the educational system. There can be, we need also, unfortunately, to an extent, the elites to be a part of this. So yeah, I think it's like I said initially, it's a slow process. But it's a process in which we first, I think, and this is also thinking of Villanova, we establish some democratic legitimacy, so we try to get people on board, and then we also try to get, let's say, sponsors or whatever, which means the political class, who will also be a part of this. We need the political interest, and we need the democratic grassroots interest in tandem.
You said it a lot of times now, and I think you're waiting for the question, the question of the day. How can Latin help with that?
Yes.
You say that the Latin is the only like real pan-European language that we have, and you see Latin as the connecting factor between all those nations and as the connecting language for Europe. And I really want to know the idea behind that. And out of that, there will be 100 questions I want to ask.
Yes, exactly. That's why I was like trying to get to the question, because I feel like we lose some people if we don't explain this thing, because it's not evident on face value that this is the right way to go. But like I said initially, when you think about, for example, what is the great unifier when it comes to language in Europe? Obviously, English. If you think about English, it's become the international lingua franca, but we have to think what English means to us symbolically. And what it means for our identity if we accept English as the second layer, apart from our national identities. English represents either, the American cultural imperialism influence, right? That's what I would argue. English was not entrenched before the Second World War in Europe. We had like multiple languages; they were all like peer on the peer level. Either represents that, the American cultural hegemony, which we do not want. We want to kind of get the cultural sovereignty, let's say, from the US in this moment. Or secondly, it represents this cosmopolitan, international kind of sentiment, right? We are all part of, to an extent, of course, we are, but we're trying to establish a separate identity, right? So there are those two extremes that English symbolizes. So English cannot serve as the European layer, right? So meaning, for example, if you have a Swiss German, you're a Swiss German, right? You speak Swiss German as sorry. So you have Swiss German as your basically layer of your Swiss German identity, and then you have the European layer and the European language alongside that. Is our assertion. So English cannot serve in that way, we believe. And then the second thing is, then we have national languages, right? We cannot, if we exalt any one national language to the status of being the unifier of Europe, we cannot exalt one part of Europe to this level. If we insert German, for example, the French would complain. If we insert French, the Italians, it's a mess, right? And then the third question is Esperanto, right? Perhaps, there were a lot of let's say pushes, and this was like very very prevalent also in the early 2000s. For example, there was a famous report that said that Europe should adopt Esperanto as its unifying language, but Esperanto carries no symbolic weight for us. It's a simplified combination of multiple European languages, and in the same way as Latin, we would have to learn it from the start, right? So the only language, like I said, that really carries with it, this cultural significance of being the unifier, of being a civilizational language, of being a language that up until recently was used in Europe as a lingua franca. Like probably 200 years ago, up until 200 years ago, it was still had a huge influence in diplomacy, academia, and stuff. Isaac Newton, for example, famously still wrote in Latin, right? It was the language of Europe, right? That is Latin, and only Latin can make us feel European, can fulfill this European layer, as we put it. So that is the assertion, right? Then we go to the realism part, because I think this is where we lose people. I think most people would agree with me on this first part, that Latin is the only pan-European language, and it does carry this weight. But then I think we lose them on how is this realistic? Is this pragmatic? All those things. So I think this is the second part.
Exactly that. I think we can agree on that. And I think it's a really important topic to also talk about language as the connection part and as the identity part, because we have the German language in the German, Swiss, Austrian region, but even in those regions you have cultural differences, like German, Swiss language. You have the German, let's say, like German language that also differs from inside the country, and you have Austrian German, and all of them connect their civilization, connect their identity also to their language. You have the French, and that are very, very proud of their language and are easily offended if you don't speak their language or you speak it wrong. So the idea of having like one connecting language, I think it's a very good idea. But let's switch to that realistic or realism part. I found different numbers, but I think the number that I found of real active and good and fluent Latin speakers goes around 20,000 when we look in Europe. So from the idea of Latin as connecting language to the facts, what is your step to that? Because like, is it just an idea to show we should have a connecting language, or is it a real goal to say, as you said before, it's a long-term project, let's get the people back to Latin language?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think it's a good intro that you made about the Germany and different type of German dialects and varieties of German, because in the German tradition, in the German idealism, Herder, for example, is very famous for introducing the concept of Volksgeist, right, where a culture is only a culture if they have their own language, and that's the means of expression, and without that, it's dead. Very famously, the Irish, when they lost, let's say, the Irish language to English, it was a time of mourning, right? To an extent, they lost their identity. I mean, I don't want to over exaggerate, but it's an important aspect of probably the most important, because in one way that you kind of conceive of yourself as part of a community is through language, right? There will be no Slovenia if there was no Slovenian language, right? There will be no common. This is expression, idea, symbolism is a very important part of community building. So. Then your question was essentially how realistic this is, and to this I point to several examples. So I got, as I said, the idea on my travels through Asia and Africa, primarily Asia, and primarily through India and China. And like I said, the linguistic integration was in at least in that aspect similar to what I'm proposing, because the standardized Mandarin came from the Mandarin dialect of Beijing. So dialect in the Chinese terminology basically means a separate language, but they don't use the same terminology as Europe because they don't need to politically, right? We need to say it's a German language, it's a Dutch language. For them, for example, all Germanic languages would be one language, and then we have dialects of Dutch and German, right? So the Beijing dialect of Mandarin, which was the imperial lingua franca at the time and carried imperial prestige, was a minority language limited to Beijing, and they were able to spread it with not modern means, but means of the 20th century, to become the lingua franca of the entire China. Basically, now more than 1 billion people speak it. I think it's a monumental feat. That isn't talked about enough. The second example is the Indian example. It's a little bit less kind of. Less big in that sense because they didn't succeed in the same way. But again, similarly, the daily dialect of Hindi was chosen as the standardized Hindi, the lingua franca, the official language of the civilizational state, right? And they were able to spread it from this limited usage in the daily area to being used by a huge chunk of the population. It was again a monumental feat. And then the third, of course, might be also the Indonesian example. So Indonesia, until the Second World War, was a Dutch colony, and it used Dutch as its lingua franca. So in a similar way, if we are kind of cheeky about it, we are the U.S. colony to an extent, and we're using English as this inheritance of this colonial status or imperial status, whatever you want to call it, right? But they chose to go the other way. They saw we cannot use Dutch. It would not be. It would not serve the nation building or whatever you want to call it. So they ditched it, and they basically exalted a minority language spoken by probably less than 5% of the people, the Bahasa language, as the lingua franca, as the official language of the entire country. Now it's spoken by 97% of the people, even though roughly 20% or something uses a native tongue. So it's a connecting language, even though it was a huge minority language at the beginning. Now, of course, Latin probably, in this regard, some might say, it's even a worse situation because, if you said 20,000, I don't know, what's the percentage of that when it comes to Europe, right? It's very small. But to that, I point to another example, that is the Hebrew example. So, when the Jews were migrating to Palestine in the 19th and 20th century, they had no unifying language. So they spoke Russian or German later on, or Ukrainian or Yiddish or something. They had no lingua franca, and more importantly, they had no language that would kind of unite them, right, in this Volksgeist spirit, let's say. So they brought up from the dead, essentially, to an extent, right, Hebrew, which was used in ceremonial activities and in prayer and stuff, but it was not used at all by anybody in an active manner. It was not a native tongue for anybody, right? and they recreated it. And not only that, they also created, and envisioned ways how it can be pronounced, because in many ways they forgot how certain words are pronounced. So it was a complete resurrection, let's say, and a linguistic miracle in the proper sense. So, and this all happened before the advent of this modern tools, which is internet, social media, all those stuff, digital tools. So I think counting all those examples in together, if there is political will, if there is cultural will, if there is the democratic will for us to create a pan-European layer, then we can recreate Latin as the lingua franca. Only thing is what we need is just the desire to do it, in my opinion. I think if we agree that Latin is the pan-European language, is the connector, is a civilizational language, then we just need to we need the will to do it. Then that's the only thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I have three questions. I'm starting with the first one that you ended with. The will to change it, because that's exactly what came in my mind when you were explaining it. Because in some of your videos, also in a recent video when you visited Venice, you pointed out very clearly that not only money and business can shape a civilization, but you also point out that the business is very important and is driving a civilization and is driving a country. Which leads me to the point that also like in big business and I think in global business, we normally agree on speaking English or speaking in some ways speaking Mandarin. So do you have any idea how you would create the will? Because I think there's no urgency right now in the people's mind to say, okay, we have to change to Latin, nor is there urgency to right now say we have to agree on one European language, because people would say, okay, we have English. So how would you create the urgency, or how would you create the will that politics and business would say, okay, we change it? Because as you said, you can put it out to the people via social media, via very fast media. But if there's no will, if there's no urge, if there's no need, I doubt that it will create a wave that we would need to have that.
I think, it's perfectly fine to use English as this pragmatic tool, because luckily for us, the American hegemony has, spread English all across the world, so it's easy to do business everywhere. I think this is changing slowly. As you mentioned, Mandarin is becoming super powerful. I think also Spanish is very powerful in the Americas. There are different languages that are spreading. I think with the rise of multipolar world and all those things, the world will fragment more and more, and linguistically as well, right? So the English as a convenient lingua franca, I think, will start to slowly lose its significance. I think this is. So we have to prepare ourselves for that world as well, right? But I think it's super fine, completely fine right now to use English as this traditional chapter. We are not advocating for let's go to Latin tomorrow, let's force it upon people at all. Now this is supposed to be a cultural movement. So if there is, and I think it will become increasingly true with perhaps the next generation, or it will start to reach more and more true, that we want to create a pan-European layer, we will need a means of expressing that layer. And this is where a level of urgency comes from. But it doesn't come from business, or it doesn't come from those things, right? If for short fixes, we need English right now. We need it for fast business, But we also need cultural sovereignty. But we cannot achieve cultural sovereignty by trading off efficiency at this stage. We need efficiency, of course. We're not blind to it. As I told you, my other project is Grow Europe, which is a business enterprise. So I'm keenly aware, and I support the whole druggy spirit of competitiveness. It's very important for us. So when people listen to this, I'm not trying to attack, this spirit. We need to innovate. We need to compete right now. This is the urgency, right? But alongside that, we can cultivate this pan-Europeanism, and this is something we do it slowly. With English as the transitional lingua franca. So I think that is the best and the most plausible way to do it. And I think with this approach, we can go very far, and so that's in a way what I think about the issue.
So, last question for this podcast always, Timi, how do you see the future in general? Doesn't have to be only Europe. What's your view of the future?
Well, right now we're living in very precarious times, right? The international world order is kind of, to an extent, collapsing in front of our eyes. I try to be optimistic about it. I think, when I talk to people like you and everybody else, I hope we are still managing to keep it together. The next generation will keep it together, and that we will build a world that's even better. Like, every generation wants to build a better world for the generation after it. So I hope that we do continue this energy and enthusiasm, and I believe that it's something I would say to the audience. Let's say that idealism is still important, right? Of course, we need pragmatism. Of course, we need to think pragmatically, and I do as well, of course. But we need to think idealistically as well. The only way for us really to find a reason why is through idealism. So through that framework, I would also on that framework I would put Via Nova as well, and everybody has an idea about how to make the world better and how to make Europe better, specifically because we are on that type of podcast right now. I think you should go ahead and do it, and if you do, talk to me as well. It will be very cool for us all to push together and to make this zeitgeist a reality.
Perfect. Thank you for your time. Thank you for this amazing talk. So many nice ideas. I have 100 questions more, but I think we will definitely meet again. And we definitely have to talk about many other topics in another episode. And in the best case, we will meet in real life and then continue our talks. So thank you for your time. I wish you all the best with the project and have a very nice day now.
Thank you very much. Ciao, ciao, bye.